Eclipse of God, Studies in the Relation Between Religion and Philosophy, by Martin Buber, quotes. Eclipse of God, by Martin Buber, is a profound exploration of the relationship between religion and philosophy, focusing on the existential crisis of modern man and the perceived absence of God in the contemporary world. Buber reflects on the notion of the eclipse of God, a metaphor for the spiritual crisis where humanity has lost its direct connection with the divine. The essays in this collection delve into the ways in which modern thought, characterized by instrumental reason and an overemphasis on the I-it relationship, has obscured the I-thou relationship essential for a true encounter with God. Buber critiques modernity's reliance on scientific and philosophical abstractions, which he argues contribute to a worldview that eclipses the experience of transcendence. His reflections call for a return to authentic dialogue and genuine relationship, both with the divine and with other people, as the foundation of meaningful existence. Quote 1. The eclipse of God is the eclipse of the possibility of experiencing human life in relation to this greater reality. This quote introduces the core concept of the eclipse of God, where modern life diminishes our ability to experience divine presence. Buber argues that modern relationships, driven by practicality and usefulness, obscure the mutual, transcendent relationship between humans and God. Just as the moon blocks the sun in a solar eclipse, instrumental, utilitarian relationships block access to deeper spiritual connections, causing the divine to seem absent in modern experience. Quote 2. God is a presence whom the human encounters in specific places and times. These encounters, like the human beings who experience them, are different from one another. Here, Buber emphasizes that God is not a metaphysical concept, but a presence that reveals itself uniquely to each individual. Encounters with God are personal and concrete, not abstract or universal. This perspective counters traditional philosophical views that treat God as an idea, suggesting that divine encounters cannot be fully captured by intellectual or theoretical frameworks, but must be experienced firsthand. Quote 3. Trust in God is not proof of God's existence, but, Buber might add, there are many things that philosophers and others take for granted for which we do not have definitive evidence. This quote underscores Buber's understanding of faith as trust, which does not require empirical proof. He compares faith in God to other human experiences, such as memory or sense perception, which are accepted without conclusive evidence. Buber contends that modern atheism's demand for definitive evidence misses the relational nature of faith, which is more about trusting in the presence of God than proving God's existence through rational arguments. Quote 4. Experience, which Buber also calls reality, conditions cognition. And again, it is our access to reality, which Buber also understands as God, that is eclipsed by an overemphasis on cognition. Buber challenges the philosophical tradition that prioritizes cognition over experience. He argues that human ideas and knowledge derive from lived experience, not the other way around. In this framework, reality, including God, is something experienced directly, but modern thinking, with its focus on intellectualizing and controlling life, has blocked this access, leading to the eclipse of God in human consciousness. Quote 5. God needs man independent, as partner in dialogue, as comrade in work, as one who loves him. God needs his creature thus, or wills to need him thus. This quote encapsulates Buber's view of the relationship between God and humanity as reciprocal. God desires a genuine partnership with humans, where they engage in dialogue and share love. Unlike other philosophical or theological views that emphasize human dependence on God, Buber suggests that God willingly enters into a relationship where humanity plays an active role, highlighting the mutuality at the heart of his I-thou philosophy. Quote 6. Faith is not a feeling in the soul of man, but an entrance into reality. an entrance into the whole reality without reduction and curtailment. This quote illustrates Buber's conception of faith as something more profound than a mere internal emotion. He sees it as a direct engagement with the full breadth of reality, not something that can be limited or simplified. Faith, for Buber, involves a genuine encounter with existence, unmediated by intellectual shortcuts or reduced explanations, making it an act of entering into the whole of life as it truly is. Quote 7. I have had the experience that I do not need this hypothesis God in order to be quite at home in the world. This statement by a worker conveys a common modern sentiment that belief in God is unnecessary for feeling secure or comfortable in the world. The speaker reduces God to a hypothesis, akin to a scientific or philosophical assumption, implying that one can navigate life without this particular belief. This reflects a worldview where God is seen as superfluous to human understanding and experience. Quote 8. What was the being that gave this world, which had become so questionable, its foundation? In response to the worker's claim, Buber shifts the conversation to the very nature of the world itself. He suggests that the world is not simply the secure, familiar place we think it is. Instead, it is full of mysteries and uncertainties. Buber's question challenges the listener to reflect on the deeper, fundamental reality behind the apparent world, something beyond what can be easily explained or categorized. Quote 9. None has become so soiled, so mutilated as the word God. Just for this reason, I may not abandon it. Buber acknowledges that the word God has been abused, overused, and distorted throughout history, often associated with violence and injustice. Yet, instead of discarding it, he feels compelled to hold on to the term. To him, despite its damaged history, the word carries an irreplaceable weight, bearing the experiences, hopes, and struggles of generations. He argues that the word God remains necessary for expressing the most profound aspects of human life and faith. Quote 10. We cannot cleanse the word God, and we cannot make it whole. But, defiled and mutilated as it is, we can raise it from the ground and set it over an hour of great care. In this quote, Buber resigns to the reality that the word God cannot be purified from the damage it has endured through misuse. However, he asserts that despite this, the word can still be elevated to address moments of deep significance. Rather than attempting to restore its original purity, Buber believes in reclaiming the word as a means of engaging with life's most critical and pressing concerns. Quote 11. The relationship between religion and reality prevailing in a given epoch is the most accurate index of its true character. Buber begins by stating that the way religion interacts with reality reflects the essential nature of a historical period. When people view their faith as connected to a reality beyond themselves, they engage in a genuine relationship with the divine. In contrast, when religion is reduced to abstract concepts or psychological constructs, it reflects a loss of real connection with a transcendent reality. The shift from a living relationship with God to a purely mental construct indicates a profound change in human understanding. Quote 12. God is not an external substance, but only a moral condition within us. This quote from Kant encapsulates the philosopher's idea that God is not an independent external reality, but a moral principle internal to the human soul. It represents a significant shift in thought, reducing God to a psychological or ethical construct, rather than a being with whom humans can have a direct, personal relationship. Buber contrasts this with the traditional view that God is an independent being outside of human subjectivity. Spinoza, quote 13, began with propositions stating that God is, that he exists not as a spiritual principle which has no being except in the mind of him who thinks it, but as a reality, a self-subsisting reality absolutely independent of our existence. Here, Buber discusses Spinoza's view of God as a truly existing reality, not just an idea in human minds. Spinoza emphasizes that God is an independent, self-subsisting being, beyond the confines of human thought. This contrasts with later philosophies, which often reduce God to a mere concept or internal condition, losing the sense of God's objective existence as a real being. Quote 14. Eclipse of the light of heaven. Eclipse of God. Such indeed is the character of the historic hour through which the world is passing. This quote signifies the current state of humanity, where God's presence has been obscured or eclipsed in human consciousness. Buber likens this to a solar eclipse, where something blocks the view of the sun, God, not because the sun has vanished, but because human orientation and perception have shifted. The modern world, with its emphasis on human-centered thinking and abstraction, has darkened humanity's ability to experience the transcendent reality of God. Quote 15. But we, the slayers, remain dwellers in darkness, consigned to death. Buber reflects on Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God, emphasizing that this death refers not to the actual end of God, but to humanity's spiritual blindness. He suggests that by denying or slaying God, humans consign themselves to a life devoid of meaning and light. Although God remains, those who reject him are left in a state of existential darkness, separated from the divine source of life. Quote 16. The personal manifestation of the divine is not decisive for the genuineness of religion. What is decisive is that I relate myself to the divine as to being which is over against me, though not over against me alone. This quote emphasizes that true religious experience is not dependent on direct manifestations of the divine. Instead, what matters is the individual's relationship with the divine as an independent and absolute reality. The divine is not merely an internal reflection of the human mind, but something that exists beyond oneself and demands a relationship that transcends personal understanding. Quote 17. All great religiousness shows us that reality of faith means living in relationship to being believed in, that is, unconditionally affirmed, absolute being. Here, Buber points out that genuine faith consists of living in a relationship with the absolute being, which is affirmed without conditions. This means faith is not about intellectual assent to abstract concepts, but about engaging in a real, living connection with a transcendent reality. This relationship is the foundation of true religious experience, shaping how believers view their existence and their connection to the divine. Quote 18. Religion is still founded on the duality of I and thou. Even when the philosophical act culminates in a vision of unity, philosophy is founded on the duality of subject and object. Buber highlights a fundamental difference between religion and philosophy. Religion is based on the personal and relational dynamic of I and thou, where the individual encounters the divine as a partner in dialogue. Philosophy, on the other hand, operates on the principle of subject and object, where the thinker is distanced from the object of thought. This distinction underscores how religion is relational and existential, while philosophy is abstract and observational. Quote 19. He who begins with the love of God without having previously experienced the fear of God loves an idol which he himself has made, a God whom it is easy enough to love. This quote underscores the importance of the fear of God as the starting point of true religious experience. Buber argues that without first confronting the awe and incomprehensibility of the divine, any love for God will be superficial, directed toward a self-made, comfortable version of God. The real God, initially experienced as terrifying and unknowable, requires a deep and genuine encounter before one can truly love him. Quote 20. Only he reaches the meaning who stands firm, without holding back or reservation, before the whole might of reality and answers it in a living way. Buber asserts that the meaning of life and faith is not something that can be discovered through detached observation or reflection. Instead, it requires active engagement with the full intensity of reality, facing life with openness and authenticity. meaning is revealed in the living process of encountering and responding to the world and to the divine, not through abstract intellectual efforts. Quote 21. Religion must know knowledge not only as a need, but also as a duty of man. This quote emphasizes that religion should not shy away from the pursuit of knowledge. Buber asserts that understanding and seeking knowledge are not just human necessities, but also responsibilities within religious life. This exploration of knowledge, however, leads humanity out of an idealized, untouched paradise into the reality of the world, where understanding and responsibility coexist. Quote 22. Only through genuine intercourse with a thou can the I of the living person be experienced as existing. This quote underscores Buber's philosophy of relational existence, where one's true self, the I, is only fully realized in genuine encounters with the thou, a being outside of oneself. These interactions, whether with God or another person, are essential for the self to emerge in its full living reality. It is through relationships, not abstract thought, that a person truly experiences their existence. Quote 23. For man, the existent is either face-to-face being or passive object. Buber highlights the dual nature of human experience. One is either in a direct relationship with the other as a thou, or observing the other as an it. This distinction forms the foundation of his I-thou philosophy, where genuine encounters, I-thou, transform how we experience the world, while detached observation, I-it, reduces beings to mere objects. Quote 24. The religious reality of the meeting with the meter, who shines through all forms and is himself formless, knows no image of him, nothing comprehensible as object. This quote reflects Buber's view that in true religious encounters, God is experienced directly as a presence beyond any form or image. The divine transcends all human attempts to conceptualize or objectify God. Religious reality is found in meeting God as the present one, not through representations or symbols, which can never fully capture the essence of the divine. Quote 25. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers and scholars. This quote highlights Pascal's distinction between the personal, relational God of biblical figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the abstract God of philosophers. Pascal, after a transformative experience, rejected the intellectualized and systematized concept of God presented by philosophers. Instead, he embraced a deeply personal God who is beyond intellectual frameworks, emphasizing the lived relationship with God rather than abstract thought. Quote 26. To think him and to believe in him is an identical act. In this reflection on Kant's existential struggle with the concept of God, the quote captures the tension between thought and belief. For Kant, thinking about God and believing in God should theoretically be one and the same, yet his philosophical system ultimately prevents him from fully integrating belief into his rational framework. This quote illustrates Kant's inner conflict as he attempts to reconcile his philosophical inquiry with faith, unable to fully grasp God as anything more than an idea. Quote 27. God is not an entity outside of me, but merely a thought within me. This quote encapsulates Kant's conclusion that God, within his philosophical system, is reduced to a concept rather than an external independent being. Kant's God is a moral principle within human consciousness rather than a living entity to be personally encountered. It reflects the limitations of transcendental philosophy in capturing the fullness of religious experience, where God exists beyond mere human thought. Quote 28. If I love God, then I no longer think him only the sponsor of earthly morals. It is that avenger of the poor whom I love. Cohen's shift in thinking about the love of God is evident here. Initially, he saw God primarily as an abstract moral ideal, but this quote shows his transformation toward a more personal understanding of God. Now, God is not just a principle upholding morality, but the defender of the oppressed, someone to be loved passionately. This marks Cohen's move from philosophical abstraction to a more intimate and relational view of God. Quote 29. He who loves God loves the ideal, and loves God more than the ideal. This quote emphasizes that while God encompasses the highest ideals, such as morality, love for God goes beyond these ideals. Buber suggests that God is more than the embodiment of ethical principles. He is a living, transcendent being who cannot be fully captured by abstract ideas. The relationship with God involves loving both the ideals he represents and his greater, incomprehensible nature. Quote 30. God is dead, as a valid statement of fact. Our generation appears to him as specifically the one which has outlived God. In this quote, Buber reflects on Sartre's acceptance of Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead, suggesting that Sartre believes humanity has moved beyond the need for God. Sartre interprets this as a generational shift, claiming that contemporary people no longer experience or require a divine presence in their lives. However, Buber challenges this view, suggesting that the perceived silence of God may not indicate the absence of God, but rather a period of divine concealment. Quote 31. He must recognize himself as the being through whose appearance the world exists. Buber critiques Sartre's existential philosophy, particularly the notion that humans must now create meaning and value in a universe devoid of God. Sartre advocates for human self-creation, proposing that individuals are the source of the world's meaning. Buber, however, argues that this perspective neglects the reality that human existence is fundamentally shaped by an encounter with a reality beyond oneself, rather than being entirely self-generated. Quote 32. He who sets in the place of it the postulate of the recovery of freedom turns aside from true human existence, which means being sent and being commissioned. Here, Buber critiques Sartre's idea of reclaiming freedom by rejecting God. He argues that true human existence is not about inventing values in a vacuum, but about recognizing the responsibility and purpose that come from being sent into the world with a divine mission. Buber suggests that freedom is not something to be recovered by rejecting God, but rather something to be lived out through one's participation in creation, as a response to a higher calling. Quote 33. The prophets of Israel have never announced a God upon whom their hearers striving for security reckoned. They have always aimed to shatter all security and to proclaim in the opened abyss of the final insecurity the unwished-for God. Buber refutes Heidegger's characterization of the prophets, clarifying that the prophets did not offer a comforting or predictable image of God. Instead, they presented a God who challenges human complacency, calling people to confront their deepest insecurities and face the demands of divine justice. This quote underscores Buber's view that true prophetic revelation disrupts human expectations, pushing people toward an encounter with a God who defies easy categorization or control. Quote 34. God can never become an object for me. I can attain no other relation to him than that of the ideas to its eternal thou, that of the thou to its eternal I. Buber expresses his belief in the impossibility of reducing God to an object of thought or analysis. Instead, he insists that the relationship with God is always personal, relational, and reciprocal. God remains a thou, never an it, and can only be experienced in the direct, living dialogue of an I-thou encounter. This quote highlights Buber's central idea of relational theology, where God is always encountered as a living partner rather than an abstract concept. Quote 35. The prophets of Israel have always aimed to shatter all security and to proclaim in the opened abyss of the final insecurity the unwished-for God. Buber clarifies that the prophets did not preach a comfortable or predictable God who provided security for his followers. Instead, they revealed a God who disrupts human expectations and demands genuine transformation. This God calls people to confront their deepest insecurities, offering a divine presence that is unsettling and challenging. Buber emphasizes that the prophetic God is one who forces humanity to become truly human by facing their vulnerabilities. Quote 36. Modern consciousness turns with its most intimate and intense expectations to the soul. Buber points out that modern thought, as represented by Jung, has shifted its focus away from a transcendent God to an inward exploration of the self. This turn to the soul reflects a move toward seeking divinity within the human psyche, rejecting traditional faith in an external, transcendent God. Buber critiques this development, suggesting that it represents a retreat into a form of psychological immanence, where God is no longer a separate relational presence. Quote 37. Man now draws back the projection of his self on a God outside of him without thereby wishing to deify himself. In this quote, Buber reflects on Jung's claim that modern man no longer projects his sense of self onto an external God, but instead turns inward to find divinity within. Jung argues that this shift does not involve humans deifying themselves, but rather recognizing the divine within their own psyche. Buber is critical of this perspective, as it reduces the transcendent God to an internal experience and overlooks the relational nature of God as a distinct, external being. Quote 38. We mean by the ethical in this strict sense the yes and no which man gives to the conduct and actions possible to him, the radical distinction between them which affirms or denies them, not according to their usefulness or harmfulness for individuals and society, but according to their intrinsic value and disvalue. Buber defines ethics as the fundamental capacity of a person to discern between right and wrong based not on external factors such as societal benefit, but on the inherent value or disvalue of actions. He stresses that ethical decision-making is a deeply personal and internal process, grounded in an awareness of one's true self and the potentiality of what one is meant to be. This understanding of ethics transcends utilitarian considerations and focuses on the essential confrontation between a person and their inner truth. Quote 39. The relation of the human person to the absolute, when and insofar as the person enters and remains in this relation as a whole being. This quote defines Buber's view of religious experience as a complete and personal relationship between an individual and the absolute. Religion, in this context, is not merely an abstract belief or a philosophical concept, but a real and living relationship that involves the entirety of a person's being. The divine, as the absolute, engages with individuals not as a distant concept, but as a personal presence that invites a reciprocal relationship. Quote 40. Living religiousness wishes to bring forth living ethos. Buber highlights that genuine religious experience inherently strives to produce ethical living. Religion, when truly alive within a person, radiates into all aspects of their life and shapes their ethical behavior. He emphasizes that the religious and ethical spheres are interconnected, with religion inspiring and informing a person's moral decisions, pushing them toward a life of righteousness and integrity. Quote 41. The man who seeks distinction and decision in his own soul cannot draw from it, from his soul, absoluteness for his scale of values. In this passage, Buber argues that an individual cannot derive absolute values from within themselves. Instead, he asserts that only through a relationship with the absolute God can a person find true, unshakable ethical standards. Without this external grounding in the divine, ethical decisions would lack the necessary foundation of absolute value and would remain subjective and relative. Quote 42. Israel shall become holy, for I am holy. The imitation of God by man, the following in his way, can be fulfilled naturally only in those divine attributes turned towards the human ethos, in justice and love. Buber reflects on the biblical call for Israel to imitate God and pursue holiness. He emphasizes that this imitation is grounded in moral attributes such as justice and love, which are reflections of divine characteristics. This call to holiness transcends mere ethical behavior, merging the ethical with the religious, as humans are invited to embody divine values and enter into a relationship with the holy. Quote 43. Through the example of the temptation of Abraham, this book sets forth the idea that there is a teleological suspension of the ethical, that the validity of a moral duty can be at times suspended in accordance with the purpose of something higher, of the highest. Buber discusses Kierkegaard's concept from Fear and Trembling, where the ethical is suspended for a higher divine purpose. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, God's command to sacrifice Isaac momentarily overrides ethical norms. This suspension is rooted in the personal relationship between the individual and God, where the ethical, which is usually universally valid, can be set aside in response to a divine call. Buber acknowledges the profound challenge this poses to traditional morality. Quote 44. God demands a sacrifice of him, but it is left to the single one to interpret what that sacrifice is. Buber points out a significant divergence in Kierkegaard's interpretation of Abraham's sacrifice. Unlike the clear directive in the Bible, where God explicitly commands Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Kierkegaard's single one must determine for themselves what God demands. This introduces ambiguity, leaving the individual to interpret God's will based on their own circumstances, which Buber suggests adds complexity and uncertainty to the nature of divine commands. Quote 45. But Kierkegaard here takes for granted something that cannot be taken for granted even in the world of Abraham, much less in ours. He does not take into consideration the fact that the problematics of the decision of faith is preceded by the problematics of the hearing itself. Here, Buber critiques Kierkegaard for assuming that Abraham was unquestionably certain it was God's voice commanding him. Buber emphasizes that the challenge lies not only in making the decision of faith, but also in discerning whether one has truly heard God's voice. This uncertainty complicates the ethical dilemma, as it raises the question of whether the command is genuinely from God or from another source. Quote 46. For Moloch imitates the voice of God. Buber introduces the idea that false gods, like Moloch, can mimic the divine voice, leading people to commit unethical acts under the belief that they are following God's will. This suggests that discernment is critical, because the demand for sacrifice might come from a false deity rather than from the true God. The risk of mistaking the source of the command adds a further layer of ethical complexity to the suspension of the moral law. Quote 47. There is no escape from it until the new conscience of men has arisen that will summon them to guard with the innermost power of their souls against the confusion of the relative with the absolute. Buber concludes by calling for the development of a new moral conscience capable of distinguishing between false absolutes and the true absolute. He warns that without such discernment, people are vulnerable to being led astray by false ideals, mistaking relative goals for divine imperatives. The new conscience must be able to pierce through illusions and recognize the limitations of these false absolutes, thus avoiding the ethical confusion that arises when the relative is mistaken for the divine. Quote 48. Religion is essentially the act of holding fast to God, and that does not mean holding fast to an image that one has made of God, nor even holding fast to the faith in God that one has conceived. It means holding fast to the existing God. Buber stresses that true religion is not about clinging to ideas, images, or conceptions of God, but about maintaining a direct relationship with the living, existing God. This relationship is dynamic and alive, like the earth holding fast to the sun itself, not just to a concept of it. He contrasts this view with philosophy's tendency to intellectualize and distance itself from the immediacy of divine experience. Quote 49. The human spirit, which adjudges to itself mastery over its work, annihilates conceptually the absoluteness of the absolute. Buber critiques modern philosophy for its arrogance in claiming mastery over reality. He argues that as philosophy seeks to reduce all things to human subjectivity, it destroys the concept of the absolute, including God. In doing so, philosophy not only erases the divine, but also undermines its own foundation, leaving the spirit without any real essence or independence. Quote 50. The assailant is consciousness, the overconsciousness of this man here that he is praying, that he is praying, that he is praying. Buber identifies a modern obstacle to genuine prayer, an overactive self-awareness that disrupts the spontaneity of turning toward God. This excessive consciousness of one's own actions interferes with the authenticity of the prayer, preventing the person from being fully present. As a result, the individual loses the ability to experience divine presence, as they are too focused on their own awareness of the act of praying. Quote 51. In our age, the I-it relation, gigantically swollen, has usurped, practically uncontested, the mastery and the rule. Buber observes that in the modern world, the I-it relationship, which views everything, including other people, as objects to be used or controlled, has come to dominate human life. This shift away from the I-thou relationship, where beings are encountered as equals and as partners in dialogue, has led to a loss of genuine connection, both with others and with the divine. The I-it mindset, focused on possession and control, blocks the experience of the transcendent. Quote 52. The eclipse of the light of God is no extinction. Even tomorrow, that which has stepped in between may give way. Buber offers hope, suggesting that although the divine may feel distant or obscured in the present, this is not a permanent condition. The eclipse of God, caused by the overwhelming dominance of the I-it relationship, is not the end of the divine's presence. He believes that what separates humanity from God may soon dissolve, allowing for a renewed encounter with the Absolute. Quote 53. The controversial question is therefore this: is God merely a psychic phenomenon, or does he also exist independently of the psyche of men? Buber points out the central issue in his critique of Jung's view, whether God exists as an independent reality or is merely a product of human psychology. Jung asserts that God is a psychic phenomenon, implying that God's existence is tied to human consciousness and does not exist independently. Buber challenges this, arguing that Jung oversteps the boundaries of psychology by making metaphysical claims about the nature of God. Quote 54. The distinction which is here in question is thus not that between psychic and non-psychic statements, but that between psychic statements to which a superpsychic reality corresponds and psychic statements to which none corresponds. Buber clarifies the key distinction. It is not whether statements about God are human or psychic, but whether they correspond to a reality beyond human consciousness. He argues that psychology, including Jung's, is not equipped to judge the existence of a reality beyond the psyche. This distinction is important because Buber asserts that faith is directed toward a reality that transcends human mental constructs. Quote 55. This intention of faith, directed towards an existing being, towards one who exists, is common to men who believe out of varied experience. Buber emphasizes that for people of faith, their belief is directed not at an imagined or psychological construct, but at a real, existing being. Faith is more than just the creation of mental images. It is a genuine relationship with the divine, whom believers trust to exist beyond their perceptions. This, Buber argues, is a critical aspect of religious experience that Jung overlooks by reducing God to a psychological phenomenon. Quote 56. Neither psychology nor any other science is competent to investigate the truth of the belief in God. Buber asserts that the truth of belief in God lies beyond the reach of scientific investigation, including psychology. While psychology may study human behavior and thoughts, it cannot pronounce on the existence or non-existence of God. Buber insists that faith and metaphysical realities, such as the existence of God, fall outside the purview of empirical sciences, which should refrain from making judgments on these matters. Quote 57. Gnosis is not to be understood as only a historical category, but as a universal one. It, and not atheism, which annihilates God because it must reject the hitherto existing images of God, is the real antagonist of the reality of faith. Buber identifies modern Gnosticism rather than atheism as the true challenge to faith. He argues that gnosis, in its various forms, replaces genuine faith with a mystical or psychological understanding of divine forces, ultimately distorting the concept of God. This approach, which seeks to unveil divine mysteries through human insight or psychology, is seen by Buber as a greater threat to the authenticity of religious belief than outright atheism. Eclipse of God by Martin Buber concludes by urging readers to recognize the importance of restoring the I-thou relationship to overcome the spiritual darkness of the modern world. Buber's exploration of God's eclipse serves as a reminder that while God may seem hidden, this absence is not permanent, but a challenge for individuals to seek authentic encounters with the divine and each other. The text emphasizes that only through genuine dialogue and relational openness can humanity rediscover its place within the greater reality of the divine. Buber's reflections inspire a call to resist the instrumentalization of life, and instead embrace a way of being that nurtures presence, mutuality, and the possibility of divine revelation in the everyday.
Curious to dive into the mind of Martin Buber? With StudyLab Pro's book GPT, it's possible. Ask questions, explore themes, and discover the depths of Eclipse of God, studies in the relation between religion and philosophy, in an entirely new way. Start your conversation now by clicking on our logo. And if you're hungry for more educational content, subscribe to our channel to keep discovering, learning, and growing. Want more than just videos? Click on our logo now to join us on our platform for multiple choice tests, in-depth content, and tools to help you ace your studies. Get started now.